I think I'm going to start. We have over 300 participants from around the globe attending this inaugural ISPM webinar in our series that we've called Story Lines, Experiences of Participatory Mapping. So welcome to you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is John Corbett. I will be your MC. I work at the University of British Columbia. Marina Brinkhurst from Mapbox is my co-MC, technical guru who will be doing a lot of the back-end stuff. Before we begin, I would first like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded lands of the Syilx Okanagan people here in British Columbia, Canada. Unceded in this context means that the land was never given away through any form of legal process, nor was it lost through warfare, a predicament that many Indigenous communities face around the world today. I'm here as an uninvited settler, yet I greatly benefit from the thousands of years of careful stewardship of these lands by the Syilx people, which in turn have made this region such a beautiful and naturally diverse place. Acknowledging the Indigenous landholders is an increasingly important piece of the puzzle of reconciliation here in Canada. But I also recognize that there are many others on this webinar on lands with similarly complicated realities, and I also acknowledge those Indigenous groups too. Could we go to the next slide, Marina? I would also like to acknowledge the institutions and supporters of this webinar. I won't name them in turn, but thank you. And again, the next slide. So the executive of the International Society for Participatory Mapping have been involved with growing the network of practitioners involved with participatory mapping over the last 5 years or so. And this includes engaging in things like the creation and involvement in conferences. But obviously COVID has put a real sort of kibosh on our ability to meet in people. So we decided collectively about 3 months ago that we would put some of our energies into putting on a webinar series. We called the webinar series Story Lines, Experiences of Participatory Mapping, because what we really wanted to get at were the stories behind the practitioners, because we have a wealth of experience of people who have been involved in participatory mapping for decades, literally. But for us not to sort of focus on sort of academic or technical things, but more on the actual storytelling behind people's experiences. And we're so lucky today to have 3 such foundational practitioners, commentators, and leaders join us. Indeed, for many of us, these are the elders of our community. Each have had a dramatic impact. Oh, I see you smiling, Giacomo. Each of them has had a dramatic impact on the communities that they've worked with, other practitioners throughout the world, as well as academics and students as well. We have Wendy Brawer, who is the founder and director of the Green Map System. Hi, Wendy. The Green Map System was launched in 1995. It's been used in close to 1,000 communities in 65 countries around the world. We have Giacomo Rambaldi, ex-senior program coordinator at CTA, but also founder of things like the YapAd website, the PPGIS listserv, and the visionary, the motivator, the convener behind the Participatory Mapping Toolbox. And then we have Dr. Mike McCall, senior researcher at the Center of Research in Environmental Geography at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, both a practitioner and an academic. And as many of you know, the creator and the maintainer of the most comprehensive list of publications related to participatory mapping. It is such a great pleasure to have the 3 of you here with us today. Thank you. Finally, before I hand over to the speakers, just a couple of very sort of short housekeeping issues. The session will last for an hour. The speakers will answer 3 questions in turn. I will introduce those questions. If you in turn have any questions, I ask you to just put it into the chat box, and we've sectioned off the final 10 minutes of the session to be able to answer those questions. So without further ado, can we go to the next slide? And our first question is, what's a favorite story about an experience with participatory mapping? I'm gonna hand over first of all to Wendy, who's going to answer that question.
Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. It's really an honor to be the first person to speak in this new series you have going on, and I've just joined your network. I'm sending you greetings from the Lenape land, and looking forward to this conversation about stories. As you can imagine, there's so many in our story box. After 25 years of work, it was hard to choose, but I opted to go to Cuba. Next slide, please. And our work in Cuba began I spoke at a conference there in 1998, and I met Dr. Rafael Torres, who was the one person who took the project and ran with it. You can see the map he made with his bioethics students on health resources, including clean water. On the right, you can see the URL for the 20th anniversary video that was just produced, and he kicks that off along with me. It's really thrilling to think about this project going full circle like that. Next slide. Dr. Torres took this project to a conference in 1999, and there it got picked up by the Centro Felix Varela, and they started making Mapa Verde Cuba under the leadership of Liana Cisnero Bedard. She is still right in the center of this network that they've woven. Still at the helm, but there's a huge number of people involved in both leadership at the local level, and it's really municipalities all across Cuba that have embraced this. So you'll see it from every corner of the country where people are making maps. And the maps are unique in Cuba in that they start with vulnerabilities and problems and then work together to solve them. So on the lower right, you'll see a mangrove forest. And this was discovered on a degraded coastline on the north end side of Cuba some years ago. And they realized all the issues there could be addressed by replanting the mangrove and other seagrasses that were then lost. And we have evidence that this work has been successful when Hurricane Maria came through, or maybe it was Irma a couple years ago, and everything else along this coastline was ruined except for the eco center, where they're not only planting and maintaining this mangrove forest, but they've created a whole nursery for testing different varieties of saltwater resistant plants to do this important work of protecting the coastline. So I took some of these pictures when I was there in 2016, 18 years later, and it was just amazing to see the methodology and how it had grown and how many people were leading the way. Next slide. Most recently, this group has taken up the COVID challenge. How do we stay healthy in a pandemic? And applying this same diagnostic tool methodology to looking at the 3 questions we posed when we made recovery icons last year around public health, recuperation, and regeneration. And their maps have actually been really important to helping keep the local authorities aware of what's going on in the community and stop addressing issues before they grow out of hand. You can follow them on Facebook at Red de Mapa Verde. When I was there in 2016, the internet was almost out of reach for everybody. There's been a sea change since then, and now almost every member of this large group, and it was 40 people who we worked with in 2016, you can see them online now. It's fantastic. Next slide, please. This project, Mapa Verde Cuba, despite the lack of paper and other resources there, have been able to publish a number of books over the years, including the most recent on the right, which you can download from that QR code. We were thrilled that Liana and her team could collaborate with Cuban, Canadian, United States, and Brazilian map makers on the book Mapping Our Common Ground, as which you see in Spanish on the right. And it's really thanks to Ken Josephson of UVic that the book looks so amazing and shares so many stories from places around the world about engaging people. Next slide. That's not all we've learned from the Cubans. Liana and Luisa came to Bellagio. I'm going to go through these slides very quickly on the upper left, and just blew everybody away with their methodology and also their videos. So they have made very good use of video to show change over time in their home place. On the top, you can also see a mural, and that was how they addressed the lack of paper and the need to reach many people at the local level. That mural inspired, for example, young people in Colombia who made a portable mural so they could actually bring it out of the school and to community events. They're using modeling clay and chalk, other materials that we'd never thought about, spread around the world. And they also came and took part, Liana and Diali and other people came and took part with the big event that took place at UVic in 2008. And it was just a tremendous exchange between Common Ground, the UVic network of mappers, and all sorts of folks who came to this amazing international event. Ken also make the graphic that you see on the lower right, which explores how this network can work together. So it's been a really tremendous contribution. By the way, Liana is now on our International Mapmakers Advisory Group. So she's continuing, and their process is continuing to inspire all our work. And I think I have one more slide. Nope, that was it. And it's my pleasure to turn this over to Giacomo. Thank you.
Good day, good evening, good morning to everybody. I'm very happy to have the chance today to share some of the stories which are stuck into my mind. I've been practicing participatory mapping for many years, and specifically one practice, participatory 3D modeling, whereby communities construct physical 3D scaled and georeference models. The two pictures you can see, the one on the left is in Fiji, where the communities mapped at 1 to 10,000 scale the island of Ovalau and the surrounding waters. And the other picture is Mount Pulag National Park and surrounding buffer zones in the Cordillera in the Philippines. Next slide, please. The process of 3D modeling has been done around the world, mainly in developing countries. I have been trying to monitor the use of the process, and this is a mapper, and you can consult and populate it on the URL which is shown there. Next slide, please. One story I won't forget is one experience I had in Kenya with the Ogiek people. When we were helping them to map their ancestral lands. 21 clans participated. Next slide, please. You can see how people participate. The participation of women depend on the cultural settings. The Ogiek men would participate, would enter data separately from women. Women were usually entering data when men were eating. But we try to be as inclusive as possible. Next slide, please. So participation on working on a 3D model opens the door for everybody to contribute. Once they follow the legend, which is the key of the map, which has been obviously generated by the community itself, everybody can contribute. Next slide, please. Yeah, with the Ogiek, there was one issue. We asked them, how would you define the land units in your area? And then they started talking, and they came up with 7 names. And then we asked them, how can you characterize each land unit? What is the differentiation? And then big discussion, and finally we opted, next slide, please, to use a matrix. And very interestingly, using the matrix, what came out, next slide, please, was very interesting. One variable was the taste of honey. And this was obviously, from a scientific point of view, you know that the taste of honey depends on the flowers, on the plants. But for them, the taste of honey was one variable which was used to define the land unit. Next slide. Another very touching moment was when I noticed that on the map there were very few trails. And I said, because when I was doing maps like this with farmers, you would see a lot of trails. But here in the forest, there were no trails. And so we asked them, why where are the trails? And then one hunter-gatherer came up and said, only hyenas walk the same way back home. We are hunter-gatherers. If we walk one way, we have already seen everything. And if we walk the same way back, the enemy can wait for us. So we'd never walk the same way back. So there were no trails. So this is very interesting logic. Next slide, please. Here you can see the community which participated in the construction of the model, which was then further expanded. Next slide. Very interesting and touching story with the Babongo and Mitsogo people, also called Pygmies, deep in the forest of Gabon. Next slide, please. These people were living inside the Waka National Park. In Gabon, at a certain point, government decided on a map to draw the boundaries of protected areas without doing due consultation with the residents. And so these people found themselves inside the protected area, inside the park, and with limitations on hunting and the use of national resources. And so some NGOs started interacting with them, and they called on us to facilitate that 3D modeling exercise. You can imagine, I was talking to one of the Babongos, telling him we can send you some booklets, something, and using the post office, and he didn't know what the post office was. Obviously, most of them were illiterate. Most of them spoke French, but we had also interpreters with us. But what was very interesting was that first of all, they immediately were able to put data and to fill in the map. You see two maps on the picture. One is blank and one is populated with information. The blank part is due to the fact that several Pygmy communities were not able to come because there were heavy rains, a couple of bridges collapsed, and they had difficulties in reaching the venue, but they populated the map a couple of months later. What was striking is that they were so passionate in entering the data, and they did it. They were able to interpret the map and populate it strikingly well. Next slide, please. We had a filmmaker with us, and this is the chief of the Babongo of that community. And I will never forget what he said. He said that through the making of the map, they proved something to humanity, and for them, the rest of humanity is the dominant ethnic group in Gabon, which are the Fang, okay, which consider the Pygmies, sorry, I have to say that, he said that, they consider them as chimpanzees. And next slide. He said, we proved to be human. And for me, that was really emotional. That was really something which motivated me to do this kind of intervention more and more and more. They were invited to eat, to have dinner with the local authorities, first time in their lifetime. The exercise showed the local authority that these people were people with knowledge, with a brain able to understand space. They proved to know the forest and the area of the park much better than the rangers, much better than the local authorities. And that was recognized in this exercise. It's not the map, it's not the output which counts, it's the process. And in the process, they proved, and they said that we proved to be human. I'm done, thank you.
I'm on, I guess. So first slide, please. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's very an honor to be in this first episode. I'm really looking forward to the next episodes when we're getting more practitioners and proponents from South countries and from indigenous communities as well. I'm looking forward to that. My first slide is just to say thank you to very, very many people. I've had most of my experience in starting from a university in the Netherlands at ITC, and I have to say there one of my companions all the time was Jeroen Verplanker. He's in one of the pictures there. But we worked in very many places. You can see in Georgia, you can see in Holland, you can see in Latin America, you can see in KwaZulu-Natal. So worked with many countries with hundreds of students. We learned on the go. But at that time, there was no guidelines for this. There were practitioners in many places, but there were no textbooks. There were no guidelines. Next slide, please. But then they started to come. And but in the middle there are two classics. I think Chief Kerry's Moose is really one of the classics because it came out of First Nations in British Columbia. And in my opinion, my view of the history of PGIS, at least, and not participatory mapping in general, but particularly participatory GIS, Canada First Nations was where PGIS started, developed, became known. And Chief Kerry's Moose is a great introduction to that. But one above it is a classic from Brazil. In Latin America, also Iconoclastes in Argentina, mostly on urban, but very good guidebooks. I have to advertise our own on the one on the left and the right, guidebooks or manuals, guías, what you want to call them, which we've written in Spanish, a general one on the left, and on the right, one which specializes in, I think, interesting cultural history, archaeology for using participatory mapping for those things, for identity through cultural history and archaeology. Next slide, please. Experiences, well, as very, very many, but one thing is experiences from working with children, the local spatial knowledge of children. It's great fun to work with children, it's very exciting, but you have to say, well, and why not? Why not? I mean, actually doing participatory mapping is enjoyable. In addition to the very serious points, political points, ideological points, cultural points, which also my colleagues are making, it's difficult not to enjoy working in participatory mapping. And for 95% of the people I've worked with in different places, children especially, they get very involved, they get very excited. There's a picture there of some kids looking at an anaglyph, a 3D image where you have to wear the glasses. And just the excitement when they put the glasses on and see, wow, the mountains jump up and the valleys go down. They then did something serious with it. They started marking environmental areas which they considered environmentally problematic, vulnerable, as we would call it. In serious, be careful when working with children, of course, because they're likely to tell you too much. They're very voluble. They'll give away secrets which they shouldn't be giving away. So that's about maybe behavior of the communities, etc. So of course, that's a very serious ethical point. The pictures on the left, this is a nice story. It's a very cute story, but it's a genuine story. We were working in one community, children were doing musical class at that time. And so this was before people started talking about musical landscapes or landscapes of music. And they just asked, well, can you put the landscape into music? And one super bright kid there said, sure. In the forest, it's like flutes playing, the birds singing and so on. And the evenings at home or with a family, that's like a guitar playing. That's the music there. And the loud drums. And he said, what's the loud drums? So he said, that's borrachos in the plaza, the drunk people, the drunk guys in the plaza making a nuisance of themselves. That's what that was his musical landscape for the place. Next slide, please. Yeah, so with it, again, sticking with the children, what the children fear and what they love, the places, the fearful places, the lovely places which they have. The pictures on the right surprised me because this is a community which had a lot of pine forest, but pine forest for resin, where people You see in the picture, they're collecting the resin, which they sell from the pine trees. It's not very economic. It's being pushed out by imports from China. This is in Mexico, by the way, close to Morelia, where I am. So it's not a great economic future working with this. But to my surprise, the children said, this is something special about our landscape. This is something, you know, which we want to grow up with. The forests and the resineros, the resina collection and community with that. On the left is more standard. There's a map made by the children saying what do they fear in their neighborhood. It's interesting, they put down dogs, they put down guards, people guarding places, the police, rough people, druggies, and alcohol. And you see the middle one also, there's a problem tree, which is focused around alcohol. But actually, I put that picture in to remind us participatory mapping is not just maps. There's all kinds of other tools, there are other things which we use with it. Next slide, please. And the other big issue, this is an issue which is much more than just observation. This is a very serious ethical, political, ideological, philosophical issue in any kind of participatory approach. Who is representing who? Who is speaking for the people? So I won't go into the more into the ethical, critical discussion of that, conceptual discussion, but something which we always have to be considerate of in participatory mapping. Don't say be careful, be considerate of. We should be thinking about this. There's 2,000 people in the community, and there's 20 people who do the mapping, or 50 people doing the modeling in Giacomo's case, because he has very big exercises. You can't say they're representative of everybody. So who is representing the people? They're usually who's speaking for people. Somebody does it, like the top picture there on the left, and the others are standing around watching. And it's usually the big man. And in reality, they tend to be big men, big, large men, bulky, who are dominating these things. Or the chief. The bottom right picture there is in South Africa. He has a cap saying chief. Actually, it's a cap from a Kaiser Chiefs band, but he is the chief. And naturally, he is the person explaining and telling everybody what to look at in their landscape. So that's the expectation. Next slide, please. Final slide. But not necessarily, not always. There's one example there from the Ogiek field work, which Giacomo was talking about. When the men were doing it, there was one lady watching. She was joining in. She was contributing. Below, we have a picture of where you especially select and put together in this case, it was school children, so the school girls to do theirs together. But I think the right-hand picture to me is the interesting one, because there was a group where there was a dominant female leader with huge initiative. She was starting this whole program, the whole project, with charisma of some kind. But nevertheless, she was the one who was dominating the group. So she was speaking for the community, well, it's a mini community, but speaking for the group. So it's not just the big men, but there is always some kind of leadership within the group, and we as outsiders with other people in the community should be thinking about how to make it more, quote, democratic, how to make it, no, not necessarily more, but just be thinking about that as an issue. That's it. Thank you very much. I'll hand on to John, I think,
So the second of the three questions are, what are the two most significant things that you've learned in the field? And so once again, Wendy, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, John. So, you know, Green Map has a set of icons that we share with everybody. People can add to them, can extend them. In fact, we're extending them right now with some local food icons. And right from the beginning, our work recognized that maps are power tools, that there's few other kinds of documents we create that have this power of changing our perspective. And I realized early on how the icons not only could identify and promote places, but would also link them. So over the years, Green Map has been a force for technology transfer. One of the things we did early on was create a font from this iconography, and that leveled the playing field in 1996 when people weren't sure how to get images into their computers, and it made it possible for anybody, any application, to use these icons. Next slide, please. So that gets me to where we are now. We're a start open. So in 2018, we said, let's move climate first and promote the urgency of it and all the other aspects around it through being open source. It also helped us extend our partnerships and develop the synergy in our network. And it's been really quite amazing to open the door with a copyleft license, and lots more people are now contributing to the global whole. So it's really helped us evolve. So I want to encourage more open source development in this network. It's really an incredible tool. I know sometimes academia or business, it's another story, but for me, it's really been remarkable. Next slide. We have a second version of our open mapping platform. In fact, there's a workshop about it on Saturday. If you go to that link, it will get you there. You can see other talks about it. But it's really made it possible for lots of different people to get involved at a different level, to have it an online tools platform as well. I have to thank the GIS Collective, who's contributing this work from Berlin, and who will be meeting with us Saturday, as usual, to learn from us. So it's this really wonderful back and forth relationship that's yielding not only maps, but also things like posters of sites in a local area. So there's lots of ways to use the data once it's in there. Next slide. And I want to say my second thing is cycles. Everything comes around. And maybe you also noticed this in your work, but there's certain themes that pop back up. There's things that get pulled forward over and over again in this journey that we're on. And I assume yours as well, that the stories inspire each other, that we hear from kids. And I totally agree with what Michael was saying about young people. We found it also gives them a different sense of responsibility to their home place once they've made a map. And we see young people coming back as adults to take part in this project. Anyways, it's been thrilling so far. I'm going to turn it over now to Giacomo to see how he will answer this next question.
Yeah, I think that for me, the key question in participatory map making is who owns the map legend? Who defines what should be visualized on the map, how to term it, and how to represent it? So every map has its own legend. I remember I was working in the south of the Philippines, and another better example is in Suriname. In Suriname, with the Saramacca people, these are ex-slaves who fled into the forest, about 20,000 people. And there are no roads, there are only rivers, water courses. And when we were populating the map and generating the legend, they came up with 7 different terms defining a watercourse. The variables were very interesting, whether it was deep, seasonal, where you could navigate with a big boat, with a small boat. Every single watercourse was defined by a term. And this allowed them to communicate with one word to define many things. And this was understood by the whole community, not by us. We had to learn and then reconcile their definition with our understanding. And this brings me to the next point, next slide. Whose worldview guides the process? We were born, we Westerners, grown up in houses with squares, straight lines. Everything is linked to something which is straight. But if you look at the house in Cameroon, in northern Cameroon, the section is round, the roof is ondulated, and I mean, there is no straight line in nature. Even the horizon is not straight. And our worldview makes us feel uncomfortable if a poster is hanging and not vertically. Automatically, if you have a painting in your house and you see it is not straight, what do? You go there and you put it straight, but there is nothing wrong if it is hanging not perfectly straight and parallel to the corner of your room. But this is how our forma mentis is of Westerners. And we have to understand that to properly accept diversity, lower our presence. In map making, the facilitator is just facilitating, is not imposing anything, is accepting, learning, listening. And I think these are the key lessons for me. And I invite everybody doing participatory mapping, make sure that the legend is defined by the community, by men, by women, by young, by elders, by kids. Everybody has something which is important for them. A rural health center is more important for a woman than for a man. In the Philippines, the men will want to prioritize the cockfighting arena. The women, no, the health center, the school, the water point, okay? So the legend should try to encompass all these different priorities, spatial issues which are priority for the different elements of society, and offer the opportunity to represent them on the map. I'm done, thank you. Next slide. Yep, Mike.
Thanks, Giacomo. Next slide, please, for me. Well, yeah, Giacomo's phrase, who owns the legend, is a classic. And it does kind of overlap with some of the things which I'm going to say. So this first slide, I won't talk about too much, but that is so important. Yes, who is determining these things? I also like his idea that we should change the shape of the Zoom screen so that it shouldn't be rectangular, it should be irregular around the edges. Nice idea. Well, something I learned I should have known already, but I learned the importance of toponyms from doing these exercises. I don't think it had always been so much emphasized. It's much more in the fore nowadays in debate and discussion on so many issues, post-colonial issues and so on, but it wasn't before. Toponyms are vital. I mean, they express the history, they express the culture, they are the culture. They are the view, they are the understanding of a landscape for people, the understanding of the historical sites, historical locations. It's over top to say they are the identity, but they're very closely related to the identity of people. And of course, it's a colonial activity, and I don't mean not just historical colonialism and contemporary, and not just from outsiders, but the Kenyan example is other ethnic groups within Kenya taking over and changing the names, changing the toponyms. So that's something I learned, the importance of that. There's an example also of children's toponyms, the example on the left from Medellin in Colombia. And of course, toponyms are places, and therefore they can be marked on a spatial representation like a map. They kind of have to be, because they are connected with physical as well as cultural, but they're physical places in the land. Next slide, please. So the other thing I learned more and more and thought more and more about, this is the second important point, is purpose. When we discuss this in courses and things, we always say purpose, purpose, purpose. It's so important, it has to be emphasized. What is the purpose of the exercise which is going on? I'm talking now primarily to the outsiders, to people like me, the teachers, the NGOs, the activists coming in from outside. What on Earth is the purpose of making this map or this model or this video or whatever it is about people's local spatial knowledge. So it's what purpose and whose purpose, for whom is, why are we making the map anyway? It must be a reason for it. There must be a reason to communicate. Everybody in the world has their mental maps already, and they don't require us to pick it out. And unless we're kind of some kind of anthropological tourist or something, we want to see how other people think. No, there must be a reason for it. So there must be a reason for a purpose for taking these ideas of people's spatial knowledge and putting them into some form or shape and method in which they can show it to other people. The sort of the obvious things, like one on the left there is people, this is from women's group, what are their feared, I like this word, feared futures. The land use will be changed to something in the future. That's their purpose, because they want to tell people that's what we're afraid of. The middle and the right-hand one, also something like that. We sort of our expectation was that we're going to talk about, yes, land use changes. The thing which jumped out for these people was damage being done by tourists, local tourists, local guys from the town coming in on motorbikes, coming on quad bikes, and you can see the damage being done to the landscape. Something which never occurred to us arriving, but that was a purpose for them, because maybe something could be done about it if they mapped it. Final slide, please. And continuation on that, the purpose isn't always predictable. The left picture shows someone, our question as an investigative group was, what are the environmental problems in your location? It's a peri-urban part of a city. Expecting her to be talking about landslides and floods and forest fires, which are all in that area. Yes, she starts marking that. Within 5 minutes, she's starting to say, what we really want to show you is social hazards, social threats, from violence, from places where there are no lights, and and there's robbery and assault. So she shifted the focus from environmental to social. And on the right is just an interesting story of, again, the question was about landslips, mudslides. The monk, who was our key informant in this case, what he wanted to say was that people were getting bad, their behavior in the village was getting bad, they lost faith, doing bad practices, and therefore the landslides were coming to hit them rather than to hit other places. So purpose is not always predictable. That's my point here. Thanks.
Excellent.
Next.
So our final question is really sort of a projection looking forward to the future. So built on the sort of collective experience of all three of our speakers over the past, where do you believe our practice will actually be will head in the future? So Wendy, over to you first.
Thank you. So what I've learned from working with people from all over the world who have many different reasons for making the map, different target audiences, different causes. Next slide. And it's a really dumb answer in this context to this question. Print maps or non-digital maps, I want to say, especially after what we've just seen from Giacomo and Michael. I think the richness in these maps, the way that people have really worked to share, even from the outside, so you don't even have to dive in, what the issues are, what is the flavor of home. It's so strong there. And, it requires a different skill set for design and communication and distribution that a digital map has. But I think these maps have so much validity and also that you can include the actual drawings and handwriting, maybe in a different way than you can on a digital map. So for us, having an archive of these maps to share with people is often a game changer, and it really can spark imaginations in some contexts where digital maps don't do it. So I think they evoke more passion from people. Next slide. And this slide, which is very messy, just illustrates the tools that we have now for working together across all kinds of former barriers that, you know, we can get together still in person. And we did that last year. On the lower right, we had a kind of a retrospective exhibit here that involved lots of people and lots of events all outside. Hardly anybody came in to see the show, but, you know, we can shift. But, you know, that we have Slack and Zoom and all these other tools now, GitLab, et cetera, where we can co-create, to me, is part of the game changer. And when you're working across the quote digital divide, I'm really proud to say that Green Map is, for many people, their first internet project. It was the first thing they learned about when they got online early on, and the first time they said, I can make something here. So regardless of the medium, that our toolkit is expanding, and so are our partnerships around the world. So I'll leave it there and pass it to Giacomo.
Yeah, well, Mike mentioned the magic word purpose. I personally think that the future as the present, the choice of the process, of the practice depends on the purpose, on the knowledge holders, and on many, many, many other factors. My experience tells me that sweating together, getting dirty together, creating something physical together is a bonding process, is a conflict management process. So the choice depends on the purpose. Do we want to address conflict, or do the people want to address conflict, and should we help them? I always say, drawing a line on a map, you seed conflict. The moment you draw a line, you make an act defining something which may be controversial to many. So what I see is the trend that everything goes digital. And increasingly, when you go digital, there are issues of privacy, confidentiality. What goes online is public. Is privacy respected? Do you get prior informed consent from the knowledge holders inputting their knowledge, their information online and making it public? And then the other question is a digital solution sufficiently inclusive? How many people type on the keyboard? 1, 2 out of 100? So when Michael was talking about the chief talking on behalf of the community, here we have one techie guy or techie lady with a computer and the keyboard and the mouse who's entering the data on the ground. There are other solutions where many other people can contribute. And this is what should be done if a digital solution is used. But then there is always the issue of the bottom of the pyramid, those who are computer illiterate, those who are totally illiterate. How can they contribute? How? So these are questions which have no answer, especially if you work with marginalized people, people who are like indigenous groups, for example, who have no digital skills, who are illiterate and so on. Now things are changing, obviously. But again, the issue is how can you make the bottom of the pyramid contribute to this collation of individual pieces of knowledge? Thank you.
Thanks, Giacomo. Next slide, please. Next slide. Only slide. There's one slide. And this is for me, is a very, well, for all of us, this is a very big issue. So can only just mention it. No way solutions to this. But the idea is that in local spatial knowledge, which is what participatory mapping is trying to represent and reproduce for some purpose, for outside and for inside, but inside between different groups. The maps, the knowledge is some knowledge of factual things, for concrete things, the same thing which standard scientists look at. And it's also the representation of people's feelings and values. So on the left-hand side is the more, not conventional, that's the right word, because they're both conventional, but one is more factual stuff, you know, so it's maps, it's people's local knowledge of where flood is likely to be, people's local knowledge of where there's deforestation, forest degradation has been happening. But these are facts, these are concrete. The reality is concrete, the reasons for it, of course, the explanations for it are much more complex, but this is something to be seen on the ground, and that knowledge must come from the people who can see it, the local people. The right-hand side is much more complex. So the right-hand side is people trying to represent feelings and values. And each of these ones is complex. The top picture is women in a community in coastal Oaxaca. And they're marking important places, not necessarily sacred places, but culturally important places. And they mark them as points. They don't mark the topography. But that's the map which they've made is marking these as points. So their 3D map is rather different from the one Giacomo normally work with. The one below is an embroidered map of the territory of another community, again with important information, knowledge is put into it. And the one on the right is even more complex. It's from it's Afro-Colombian setting, hair design as markers of place, as markers of identity of place. And all three of these, of course, are maps, because they're maps in that they're spatial, as well as maps like in mathematical, you know, they're representing something, but they're actually specifically spatial. And so the question is, in the future, how do we reconcile, perhaps even that's too strong a word, how do we manage to deal with these different kinds of spatial knowledge of people, knowledge about space, knowledge about place from different people, and how do we bring them into this participatory mapping world? And I hand back to John. I think that's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much to our three presenters. So we have a few questions coming in right now. Some are quite sort of pragmatic and others quite broad. So I'm going to start with the first one that was actually put forward by Fayez Bakir. So this question is to all the panelists. What problem have you tried to solve with mapping? How has it helped, and what technology have you used? I know you've answered a little bit about that, but maybe if there was any one particular problem that you felt that you could address using your practice, I think this would be a great thing to quickly share.
Sometimes people don't have a sense of place at all. They don't know that there's an environment around them, and they don't even have to be a newcomer to a place to have that feeling. And for me, sometimes the mapping is really about helping, just as you named this panel, it's all about the roots. So I'll pass it on.
Giacomo?
Well, conflicts between neighboring communities, land tenure issues. I mean, for example, in the Philippines, you had the issue of ancestral lands. There was a law which would put in place recognizing titles if proper documentation was presented, and participatory mapping was used by several NGOs in the Philippines to help indigenous communities to really document very thoroughly, to prepare documents which then allowed the communities to obtain titles on their ancestral land. If there is an enabling environment, legal environment, which allows the mapping to feed into a process, then the likelihood that the mapping exercise and the outcome, the output and the outcome will be positive. If it is antagonistic, then it can help an advocacy process. So there is what you call also counter mapping and all this. There are many issues related to environmental conservation, as I said, land tenure, conflict, rights of access And what is also very interesting, I did 3D mapping of the seabed, of the coastal areas. And that is fascinating because fishermen, they know everything you don't see, okay? And their wealth of information comes out, the status of health of the coral reefs and so on. So you can develop really community-based management plans of the resources, and people, when they have this stake in deciding, first of all, in making the analysis themselves of their own problem, then they find solutions which are commensurate to their capacities, their implementation capacity. It's not the external consultant who comes, identify their problems and makes suggestions on how to go about it, which is the huge mistake in development. You have to enable community to make their internal analysis by themselves, facilitate the process. They will find the issues, the root causes, and they find the solutions.
Mike.
Okay, thanks. Well, perhaps just I have to say first 2 levels of answers, personally, and what I've read, I've seen in, like, as mentioned by John, about 2,000 or 3,000 exercises in PGIS, Cartografia Participativa, et cetera, from around the world. Myself, because I'm mostly involved in teaching and so on, I certainly have not changed anything. Well, I hope I've changed some ideas and some views and learned, people have learned something, but it would be far too strong to say that we've changed anything on the ground. But I can say that in the exercise we've done, what have people wanted to show? What purposes do they see for it? A big one is land claims, making land claims for something, including in a more abstract way in urban areas. This is our neighborhood, and this is why it's our neighborhood, and this is why we want to protect, conserve, improve, etc. our neighborhood. That's what first reason. And the second concrete thing is about disaster risks of different kinds, including climate change. People are mapping where climate change has affected their rural area or perhaps their urban area. Especially in women's groups in urban areas, it's a lot about areas of security and insecurity and so on, which of course is another risk thing. But very quickly, okay, if you read my bibliographies, you will find, I think, that around the world, of the thousands of exercises, and these are not talking about the theoretical conceptual stuff, blah, blah, about that. No, this is people actually really doing it. The greatest, the biggest purpose is land claims, not just from indigenous groups, but from other groups as well, people struggling against various outside forces for their land. The second biggest one is about landscape management, natural resource management, as it's often called, within their own territory, better ways, more knowledge from other people within the community, not just the leaders, about ways to protect and improve and well, natural resource management. The third, which is actually related to the first one, is about identity and history. This is more strong in indigenous groups, that the older people want to hand on knowledge to the younger generations who spend too much time on social media, etc., or doing stuff like this. So hand on real, and there's some very interesting cases of that from all around the world. North America probably leading the case, but Australia, the cases, I mean, Australia, Africa, Arctic Russia, indigenous people wanting to preserve and hand on to the next generation. So the mapping is for that reason. The fourth one is disaster risk, which I'll talk about. Many, especially flooding, it seems to be popular to use participatory mapping in flood areas. I mean, there are reasons for this, which you can look at. Next one is conflicts, not so much, but it's used specifically to deal with conflicts. And associated with that, I say, is general equity. So spatial equity, environmental justice issues, and spatial justice issues. So those are the real things which real people are doing with this. And whether they're successful, I don't know, I have to look, but that's what they're trying.
Thank you so much. That was definitely a question which we probably could have built an entire webinar around. There are other excellent questions. Thank you so much, Ligia, Emily. But also, I would ask you, particularly if there were any academics that they could read Jordan Nelson Long's question in the Q&A section there, because sadly we're going to have to end there. We've reached the end of our first webinar. I would like to first of all thank so much Giacomo, Wendy, Mike for your contributions, Marina for your support, and of course all of the participants for actually being here, turning up today. This is the first of 3 webinars that we'll be having this year. The second one will be looking specifically at participatory mapping in Indigenous contexts, as Mike's already alluded to. And the third one will be looking at participatory mapping in the South. And I really hope that you'll come and join us for those sessions as well. Thank you so much, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.
Marina. Thank you, John Ray, for
Yes.
organizing.
Thanks, John. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Okay. Ciao, ciao. Hasta luego.
Okay, I'm going to end the meeting for all.